Numeral 5, the American Civil War. The first year of the war, 1861, we know from a previous lecture that the first skirmish of the war is Fort Sumter, and after that, 4 additional southern states secede, the Upper South, and so now we have a total of 11. And so in 1861, the nation is bracing for war. Americans, both in the North and the South, believe that it's going to be a very short war. We can see this because most men only signed up for 90-day enlistments. They're only going to be in the U.S. Army for 3 months. Everybody thinks it's going to be one big, glorious battle and the war will be over. So there was no need for a draft in either the North or the South. Thousands of volunteers signed up. They thought it would be an adventure. They thought they didn't want to miss out on the action. And so we see early on in the war, no problem and there's no need for a draft. Because of this, we see in almost every American war, we see a whole bunch of patriotic songs emerge at the start of the war. On the left, you see Dixie, which is the Southern song that emerges from this time. And in the song lyrics, they talk about how they're fighting for home and country, and they're proud of the South. On the right, we see the Battle Hymn of the Republic. That was one of the major patriotic songs of the North. And if you look at the lyrics, glory, glory, hallelujah, the author is saying that the North has God on their side, that they're fighting for freedom and liberty. And so we see both an outpouring of patriotic songs in both the North and the South. So, the first major battle of the war is called the Battle of Bull Run, or the Battle of Manassas. The North and the South don't agree on much. They can't even agree on what to name their battles. The North usually names their battles after physical features like Bull Run Creek, and the South usually name their battles after local cities like Manassas Junction. And so if you look on the map, the Northern Army's in Washington, D.C., and the Southern Army's just a little bit south of there, about 90 miles away in Richmond, Virginia, the two capitals. And so for most of the early part of 1861, the North is getting their army together. They have these 90-day enlistments. And so they march down towards Richmond from Washington, D.C. Now, it's a very new army. They haven't had a lot of time to train. And so it takes them about 2 weeks to march the short distance on the map from Washington, D.C. to Manassas Junction. It takes them this long, like I said, because they're just not a very well-prepared army. So the battle begins, and at the start of the battle, the North looks like they're going to be winning. They have more men. They push against the Southern lines, and the Southern lines start to break and run. And so people are thinking this is the end of the war. You hear troops saying, huzzah, on to Richmond. But just in the nick of time, a Southern reinforcements show up under a guy by the name of General Thomas Jackson. You can see him in the bottom picture. And he urges his men to stop running. He stands there, and one of the other Southern generals trying to rally his men, keep them from running away, he points up the hill where Jackson is, and he says to his men, look, stop running, stand firm like they're up there where Stonewall is standing. And so we get this Stonewall Jackson nickname for him. And so he's going to emerge as one of the major generals of the South during the war. So because of Stonewall Jackson's ability to rally his troops and stop them from retreating, we see that the South turns the tide of the battle, and the North starts running away from the battle. And we see this becomes the first significant battle of the war and a Southern victory. If you remember, it took the Northern Army 2 weeks to go 20 miles from Washington, D.C. to the town of Manassas Junction. It takes them about 2 hours to run back to Washington, D.C. because they're motivated. And so it's called the Great Skedaddle. The first major battle of the war, the South win. They just have better generals in the East. And so a rude awakening, that means that the nation is shocked. They realize after the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas that it's not going to be a short war. It's not going to be a one-battle war because the South won this battle, but yet the war continues. They also realize, they look at the casualty list, and they're much higher than anybody had thought they would be. It's because Northern and Southern generals still use old battle tactics. They still mass their men together and go right at the enemy in big human waves, because that's what you had to do in the past. Weapons just weren't that accurate, and you had to get close to the enemy to kill them. But now we have new inventions in warfare. We have rifles instead of muskets. Rifles are guns that are much more accurate. By the end of the war, we're going to see Gatling guns or machine guns. And so the war is getting much more deadly, but the generals still haven't figured out that you have to change your tactics for that. And so Americans, after Bull Run, realize it's going to be a long war, and it's going to be a very bloody war. So Lincoln has to come up with a plan for winning this thing. Now, he has to be the aggressor. The South is seceding, so all they have to do is sit back and say, we're gone, and we're just defending our territory. So Lincoln has to devise a plan to go bring the South back to the Union. And so what he calls the Anaconda Plan. Anaconda is a large constrictor. It's a large snake. And so what we can see on this map is we can see the South in this yellow color, and they are selling their cotton to England to get war materials. We know by now that the South has very little manufacturing. And so Lincoln realizes he must cut this off. So he starts to put up a blockade around the coast of the South, pictured by these ships, to keep the South from trading with the British. So anytime a southern ship leaves a southern port with cotton, the United States Navy will try to sink it or capture it, so they can't trade their cotton with England for English manufactured goods like cannons and bullets and bayonets. At the start of the war, this has not worked very well. The U.S. Navy is too small. It's easy for the South to evade the blockade. But as the war goes on, the North builds more and more and more ships, better ships, and by the end of the war, 1865, the South is hardly able to get any ships out to England and get resupplied. So this is a successful strategy. At the end of the war, the South just runs out of materials to fight the war. They can't make their own, and they can't trade them for England. The other part of the Anaconda Plan is divide and conquer. Lincoln realizes that if we can slice the South in half, we effectively reduce their ability to wage war. And so the line you see on the map is the Mississippi River. And so one of the major strategies of the Anaconda Plan, besides surrounding and strangling the South's ability to get weapons, is to divide them in half. And so we will see throughout the course of these notes that Northern generals will dive down, straight down through the South, and cut it in half by taking the Mississippi River. Then once they cut it in half, they'll try to cut it in half again, and so forth and so on, until the South has been chopped up and disposed of. So 1862, we don't see any more major battles in 1861, because at this time, both the North and the South, they would gather their troops, they would come together for one big battle, lots of casualties, and both armies would drift apart for a couple of months, rearming, getting reinforcements, recovering from the battle before they would go at it again. So we didn't see a lot of more battles in 1861. And when 1862 dawns, Lincoln has hired a new general. He has hired George B. McClellan, who you see in the picture. McClellan is an up-and-coming general, young general. He's had a little bit of success in 1861. And so McClellan has a talent. He is very good at organizing the army. If you remember, part of the problem in 1861, the Northern Army broke at the Battle of Bull Run because they weren't very disciplined. They took forever to get anywhere. And so you can see from this artist's painting is that he is a great organizer. He gets the Union Army organized. He gives them uniforms. He gives them training. And he makes them look and act like a real army, much more prepared to go into battle. The problem is, though, is that McClellan, even though he's a great organizer, he's not a great general on the battlefield. He always assumes that the enemy has more men than he does, and so he's very paranoid about it. And so we go fairly far into 1862 before we see a battle, because Lincoln keeps going to McClellan and he's saying, okay, you've got your army, you've been given more troops, you've trained them wonderfully, now take them out to fight. We need to go get the South and bring them back. And McClellan would always say, I don't have enough men, we need just a little bit more time to train, oh, the South outnumbers us. And so we have this very friction-filled relationship between McClellan and Lincoln. Lincoln wants to get on with the war, he wants to go get some victories, and McClellan is always saying, no, I don't have enough men. Eventually, Lincoln is able to convince McClellan to go out and fight, and so McClellan comes up with his plan called the Peninsular Campaign. If you can see at the map, Washington, D.C. is there in blue, and it's a very good plan. McClellan is going to put the United States Army on barges, and he's going to float them down the Potomac River all the way into the Chesapeake, and then they're going to land on a peninsula that is south and east of Richmond, Virginia. Now, if that happens, then the Northern Army, oddly enough, will be closer to the Southern capital than the Southern Army will. The Southern Army is still way up north at Manassas Junction. They haven't moved since the Battle of Bull Run. And so if McClellan can pull this off, he could win the war because his army will be down on the peninsula a lot closer to the Southern capital. In order for this plan to work, though, McClellan has to move quickly, which of course is not his strength. So he lands on the peninsula, and as he starts marching up the peninsula, There's only about 1,000 Confederate troops facing him. Like I said, the rest of the Confederate troops are up at Manassas. And so the Confederates need these 1,000 troops to delay McClellan's army, which is about 80,000. And so they do this because the general in charge of these 1,000 Confederate men, before the war, he was an actor. And so he realizes that he has to bluff. He has to make McClellan believe that he has more men than he actually does to delay McClellan's advance so the rest of the Confederate army can get down to Richmond to defend the capital in time. So one of the things he does is he has his troops chop down trees. You can see the logs there in the picture. And he has them paint them black, and he puts them up on the hills. And as McClellan's army marches towards Richmond, he sees through his binoculars thousands of artillery pieces, what he assumes are artillery pieces that are looking at him. And so the whole 80,000 man Northern army comes to a halt, and they stop for days trying to figure out how to get through these cannons, and that gives the rest of the Confederate army time to get back down to Richmond. Now eventually McClellan figures that he's been duped, and these are not cannons, these are not artillery pieces, they're logs, but it points out that McClellan's weakness. He is not a decisive general. He doesn't know how to roll the dice and gamble and go right for an objective. And so McClellan and Lincoln argue about this again. Lincoln struggles at the start of the war to come up with a general who can go against Lee. Robert E. Lee is on the left, top left there of the pictures. Robert E. Lee is going to fight McClellan, and they're going to have a whole series of victories in the Peninsular Campaign, one after another after another. And so far in the east, between Washington, D.C., we see nothing but Confederate victories, really, between the two forces. The people in the North start to feel very depressed. The war morale is down. Lincoln desperately needs a general who can provide him with a victory. Right. So that gets us to Antietam. So it's September now. Several months have passed since the Peninsular Campaigns. Lincoln, of course, still has McClellan as the general in charge of his armies, but he's not happy with him. And so General Lee, if you can remember from the previous picture I showed you, he's in the top left-hand corner. He's in charge of the Confederate Army. General Lee decides that he wants England, as you can see in the picture, he wants England to join the South in the war. And the only way to do this, he believes, is he has to convince England that the South could win this war all on their own. And so he needs a convincing, decisive victory. And even though he's had those, they've all been in the South. And so Lee wants to convince England that anytime he wants, the Confederacy can go up north, have a victory, they could win this war. If he can do that, if he can get a victory up in the north and invade the north, then he believes that England will formally come into the war and send not just their materials, but also their troops. So Lee here is gambling a little bit. He's gambling everything that he can have a decisive victory in the north, end the war by bringing the English in on his side. So he takes his army up and he invades Maryland, just a little bit north and west of Washington, D.C. On the way up, some of his troops lose the battle plans. They were sitting around a campfire, and they were about to have dinner, and some northern troops stumbled upon them and chased them off. So the northern troops sit down and they start eating the southerners' food in this little skirmish that after they had chased them off, and they start having cigars, and wrapped around the cigars are all of Lee's battle plans that he had given to one of his commanders. And so now the North knows exactly how many troops they're facing and exactly where they are. And so for once in his life, General McClellan moves quickly and decisively. The two armies meet at a place called Sharpsburg or at Antietam Creek. It is the bloodiest single day of fighting in the Civil War. The armies smash into each other in September that day, and at the end of the day, nobody has won the battle. And so by the second day, instead of attacking again, McClellan waits. He waits for reinforcements. He figures now the information that he has that they've discovered is old, that Lee must have gotten more troops. And so he doesn't do anything on the second day. Third day arrives, and when McClellan is about to go attack Lee, Lee's army has left the field of battle, which was a huge opportunity missed for the North and McClellan. He had General Lee and the Southern troops where he wanted them. They were a long ways away from the South. He had their battle plans. If he would have just continued to attack, the North probably could have wiped out the Southern army, but he didn't. And so, once again, we see that Lincoln is struggling to find a general that will work for him, a general that will take chances, a general that will attack. And so, because Lee is able to get away and escape, President Lincoln fires McClellan, and he's looking for a new general. However, this is technically a victory, Antietam, for the North, because even though they didn't destroy the Southern Army and they didn't take advantage of their opportunities, Lee did leave the field of battle. So Lincoln says the American public needs a victory, and so he calls Antietam a victory. And he wants it to be a victory because he understands the North needs this moral victory, right? So we see horrible pictures. This picture is taken by Matthew Brady. He is perhaps the most famous photographer of the Civil War. We see that photography, or daguerreotypes as they were called at the time, is a new invention that is bringing the horrors of the war home to people who are not on the battlefront. So, like I said, it is a Union victory, sort of. The South didn't get destroyed, and they should have been, and they did leave the battlefield. So I guess we can call it a Union victory. Next, the war out west. So there's two theaters to the Civil War. One is in the east. A theater means where fighting is. One is in the east between Washington, D.C. and Richmond. The other is out west, west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the commander for the North out here is a guy by the name of General Ulysses S. Grant, G-R-A-N-T. You see his picture there. He is going to fight a whole series of battles out west, Forts Henry and Donelson, another battle called Shiloh, and all of these are victories for the North. Now, they're very bloody battles, just like a lot of them in the Civil War, but it's clearly a Northern victory. And so we have a rising star out west. We have a general who is not afraid to take risks. We have a general who can fight and defeat the Southerners. And so eventually we will see that Grant will get promoted and promoted and promoted out west, and eventually he will get promoted to go out east to fight Lee, but not until 1864. So Grant is starting to make a name for himself. At the Battle of Shiloh, another major battle of the Civil War. At the battle, of course, the North wins, but the people who don't like Grant, his political opponents, said that he was drunk in the middle of the battle and he shouldn't get any credit for it. And Lincoln didn't care. He said, "Find me the brand of whiskey that Grant was drinking, and I'll send a barrel to each of my other generals." The point is that he just needs generals to win. He doesn't care how they do it. He just needs victories. Also in 1862, we see the United States Navy. You can look on the map. They take the city of New Orleans. So if you look on the map, you see that Grant from Cairo, Illinois, he's moving south through Fort Henry and Donelson in Tennessee, and then he fights the Battle of Shiloh on the Mississippi River, and he's driving south down the Mississippi. The Navy is driving north, and this is part of the Anaconda Plan, that they are going to divide the South in half by taking Mississippi. The only significant town that has not been taken at this point by the Union Navy or the Union Army is Vicksburg. So we'll talk more about that in 1863. Letter C, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, if you remember, at the beginning of the war, Lincoln was very clear. He said that I am not fighting this war to end slavery. He didn't do it because he was afraid of losing the border states. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, they're all slave states. They haven't seceded, and Lincoln is afraid that if he says that this is a war about ending slavery, he will lose 3 more states to the south, that they will secede. And so that's why he was very clear in 1861 that this is not a war to end slavery. But as 1861 progresses, and then in 1862, we have all of these Union losses, and Lincoln realizes that he is going to have to change the goal of this war. Right? He needs to find a different way of winning. He cannot just say this war is about bringing the Union together, because that's not working. And so Lincoln decides that in 1862, he decides that he is going to have to transform this war about being about slavery. And so what he does, he realizes that if he does this, if he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and he says that we are going to end slavery, then that's going to help him win the war for several reasons. One, if he says this is officially a war about ending slavery, this will keep England from entering the war on the side of the South. The people of England are abolitionists, and if this is officially about ending slavery, they will not let their government fight on the side that is promoting slavery. So that would help him win the war. Plus, if he issues the Emancipation Proclamation ending slavery, then it will deprive the South of a huge labor force. He is hopeful that if he issues the proclamation, slaves will hear about it, they will stop growing cotton, they will run off the plantations, and the South won't be able to pay for the war anymore. So there are lots of advantages for making this war about slavery. He didn't issue the Emancipation Proclamation earlier because he kept having these losses on the battlefield, and he didn't want it to look like the United States was transforming the cause of the war, slavery. He didn't want to issue the Emancipation Proclamation and look like it was out of desperation. So he was waiting for a victory. And that's what Antietam was, if you remember, in 1862. Antietam was sort of a victory, and so Lincoln let it be known in late 1862 that he's going to free the slaves. And he does it on January 1st, 1863. We start the year, and it says that all slaves that are in the dark brown on this map, current Confederate territory, are free. And I told you the reasons why he wants to do that. He tries to weaken the South. But the Emancipation Proclamation also says that all of the slaves that are currently in Union-held territory or border states that are loyal to the Union, in red on this map, are not free. So Lincoln did not free any of the slaves that he currently could because they were in Union territory, and he frees all of the slaves that he physically can't because they're in the Confederacy. So why does he do this? Well, he specifically doesn't free the slaves in the border states because he's again afraid of having the border states secede. So he says for the remainder of the war, if you are a slave currently under Union control in a border state, you will remain slave. That'll keep the border states happy, they won't secede. But as the Union Army marches down south into Southern territory, wherever we go, we will be freeing the slaves. And he's hopeful that, again, the Southern slaves, when they see the Union Army coming close, they'll run off the plantation to join the Union Army, or at least be protected by the Union Army, and that'll deprive the South of their labor force. So it's a pretty ingenious solution of being able to weaken the South, free the slaves, but also not lose the border states. So the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's a great segue. Let's talk about African Americans and in the U.S. Army. Now, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, thousands of African Americans were running off their plantation, and they were running over to northern lines. And so there's this general, a northern general named Benjamin Butler, and he writes to Lincoln and he says, "Look, Lincoln, I have all of these African Americans that have run away. What do you want me to do with them? Do you want me to send them back to their owners? Do you want me to employ them in the army? What do you want me to do?" And so the United States government passes the Confiscation Acts of 1861 and 1862. The Confiscation Acts say that whatever runaway slaves come to the Union, cross over into Union lines, we can use them as contraband of war. We see a picture on the left. So this guy is a runaway slave who the Northern Army is now going to use to dig ditches for the army, to dig latrines, to guard supply depots, to pick up dead bodies on the battlefield. This is going to help the war effort because usually these are jobs done by white soldiers. And if we're going to have African Americans do this, then that frees up more white soldiers to go to the front and to fight. So even before African Americans would join the military, by being in some of these support roles, by digging the trenches, by guarding supply depots, etc., they are helping the North win the war, even if they're not on the front lines fighting, because they're freeing up white troops to go fight. Now, as we go forward into 1863, more and more there is pressure among abolitionists to force Lincoln to let African Americans not just be contraband and do support roles, but also put on a uniform and fight. And so, of course, Massachusetts is the center of the abolition movement. And so one of the very first black regiments that is going to be formed in the Civil War is from Massachusetts. It's called the 54th Massachusetts. Frederick Douglass was key in creating this regiment. African Americans sign up in droves to not just be contraband, but they want to be soldiers. They want to fight for their freedom. After all, Lincoln has said now in 1863 that this war is for them. It's for their freedom. And so we see segregated units form. Segregated units, if you look in the picture, all of the enlisted soldiers are African Americans. Northerners are very racist at this point, just as much as white Southerners, and so they don't want their troops fighting in the same unit as African Americans, and so we have a segregated army. We have all white units, we have all black units, and never the two shall meet. In fact, the U.S. Army won't be desegregated until 1948, almost 100 years later. But we do see African Americans fighting in the Civil War. The 54th Massachusetts is just the most famous. Of course, they're still going to have to face discrimination, even if they are fighting for the North. They get only $10 a month instead of $13 a month is what white soldiers get. So we're going to pay them less for the simple reason that they're black and they're not white. And so that's a form of discrimination. They're also discriminated against because there can't be any African American officers. If you look in the picture, the officer in the picture is white, and up north it was considered an honor to be an officer. They were supposed to be a gentleman, and so the North said, look, you can have African Americans in the Army, but no African American officers. That's reserved for white men. So we see discrimination. Next, some African Americans do see action. They do see combat in the war. The 54th certainly does. But a lot of the soldiers that will be African Americans in the war, they will still be used like contraband as support roles. But as I said, that still helps the North win the war, freeing more white troops up to fight. All told, about 180,000 African Americans fight in a Northern uniform during the war. And as the war continues and the North is running out of white volunteers and having to resort to the draft, Lincoln has said that this made all the difference. These 180,000 troops who, as the war goes on, we start running out of white troops, we start using them more and more and more in combat roles, and Lincoln says that they tipped the balance in the war, that they gave us more troops just at the point of the war where we were running out of white troops, and they're decisive in the Union victory. The South does see some African Americans fight in the Civil War. It is at the very end of the war when the South is desperate for men, and they're running out of troops as well. But it's not a very popular program, and a lot of African Americans don't take them up on it. Southerners, plantation owners would go to their slaves and say, look, it's at the very end of the war. We'll give you your freedom if you fight for us. As you can imagine, not a lot of Southern plantations wanted to do this, and certainly not a lot of African Americans when they could just run away and join the Northern Army and fight for their freedom. Women in the war. And so we see that women, of course, play an important part in winning the Civil War. For middle and upper class women, if you remember Catherine Beecher from a previous unit, she told upper and middle class women to leave the cult of domesticity and go lead reform movements, go make society better. And so in this generation, we see women doing that who are trying to help out with the war effort. One, of course, on the left-hand side, you can tell she's middle and upper class by how she's dressed. Her name is Clara Barton, and she forms what we still have today, the American Red Cross Society. The purpose of the Red Cross was to create a whole corps of Army nurses that would go and administer to the sick and to the wounded men from the Northern Army. This is something that was desperately needed. Northern military hospitals were horrible places, overcrowded, not enough help. Men would often die of disease and infection. And so here we see women using what traditionally has been their role of nurture and care, and they're leaving the home, and they go and they support these soldiers. They bind their wounds, they clean them, and the death rates of infection go down. So they certainly do a lot to help the Northern Army cope with their wounded. Now, these women are kind of rebellious, the women who join the Red Cross, because the upper-class woman is still supposed to be in the cult of domesticity. And here we have these women nursing men who they don't know. They bathe them. They dress their wounds. So they're seeing men who are naked. They're seeing horrible wounds, things that women are not supposed to see. And so this was sort of a social rebellion for women. But when the war is over, women will begin to dominate the nursing industry. And so we see some long-term effects on women. They will stay in nursing. Another career that we see women start to go into at this time is teaching. Ever since Horace Mann in the previous unit said we should have education reform, we see women go into that career too. Now, it doesn't have a lot to do with the war, but we see after the 1860s, women will be leaving the cult of domesticity more and more. Still a minority, but they'll be going into roles that jobs that kind of go with their, what society says is their natural caring attitude, nurses and teachers. Now, lower class women did not join the Red Cross as much because they have to support their family while their husbands are away. And so we see lots of women in the North go and work in factories. We see them, of course, the Army still needs clothes and they need guns. And so the men are away fighting. And so we see more and more women join the factory workforce. And this will continue. We see that the war increases the amount of women working in factories. And after the Civil War, we still see lots of women working in factories. So certainly the role of women will be changing because of the war. This gets us to Gettysburg, perhaps the most important battle of the Civil War, certainly the biggest battle of the Civil War. Now, just like back in 1862, Lee has won a whole bunch of battles after Antietam that we haven't talked about, and so he's been on a roll. He's won many, and so once again, Lee is holding out hope that if he can invade the North and get a victory, that England will once again entertain the idea of coming in on his side. And so again, Lee gambles everything, and he goes far out of the South, up through Maryland this time and into southern Pennsylvania. And he's looking to, like I said, get a smashing victory that will convince the English that it's time for them to come into the war and support the South. Now, Gettysburg lasts for 3 days. It's July 1, 2, and 3 of 1863. And on the third day, we can see this map on the right. We have this thing called Pickett's Charge. It's where approximately 15,000 Confederate troops, shown in red, they charge up this long hill to hit the Union center, hit the Northern Army right in the middle. And the South comes very close to winning this battle. 15,000 men do attack the Union line. They get to the very top of the hill. They are punching through the Union line. In fact, Lee, through his binoculars, is looking at the battle, and he says, "By God, we've done it. We have won the war." Because he knows if he can get through the middle of the Union line, they can just destroy the Union Army piecemeal one at a time, and there's nothing stopping them from marching on to Washington, D.C. So this perhaps marks the closest point the South had of winning the Civil War on the battlefield. But just in the nick of time, Northerners arrive, and they are able to push the South back, and not just push them back, but encircle and surround a lot of these troops, these 15,000 troops, and a good percentage of them run away and don't make it back to the Southern lines. And Lee never recovers from this loss. He lost 15,000 of his best troops. He will never again invade the North, and for the rest of the war, even though he will win victories, he will never again be able to mount as big of a charge against the North. He will be constantly running out of men because he's lost his best men on the fields of Gettysburg. And so we see this is definitely a turning point of the war. Of course, Gettysburg is also famous for the Gettysburg Address. So Gettysburg happens in July. By November, they've had time to clean up the bodies, to tidy up the battlefield a little bit. And so the North, there are so many men who died, killed, or wounded on this battle, over 50,000, that the North decides to make the battlefield a national monument. And so we see that people come from all around, and they're going to have a day of speeches to commemorate and dedicate this cemetery, this battlefield as a cemetery. And so they invite Lincoln, and Lincoln comes up and he gives a speech. Now the guy in front of Lincoln, the guy by the name of Edward Everett, gives a 2-hour speech. And so when Lincoln gets up, people thought, well, this is going to be a long speech, and they settle in. And you can see the length of the speech. It's entirely composed on this page here, 77 years ago. It's a very short speech. And so when he was done, people did not like the speech. They thought, look, all these men died here. 50,000 some men were killed or wounded, and you give us 2 minutes of a speech? The guy before you gave 2 hours. And so people didn't like the Gettysburg Address when it was first issued. But since that time, we understand that the Gettysburg Address, in a very concise way, tells us what we're fighting for. When he says in the very beginning that 77 years ago our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, he's saying that this is what America is about. We are a country created in liberty, and we believe that all men should be equal, including African American men. Right? So he's clearly laying out that this war is about slavery. And so if we look down on the very bottom paragraph where there is an ellipse, he said that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of their devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. He is succinctly saying that this war is about giving a new birth of freedom. We already have liberty for white men, but this war is about giving us liberty and freedom and equality for African Americans too. And so he clearly says now that the aim of the war is not just to bring the Union back together, but with the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address, this war is about giving a new birth of freedom to all Americans. And so he makes the war for something very noble. And so the reason the Gettysburg is so famous, the Gettysburg Address, is because it just simply, quickly tells America what they're fighting for. So, 1863, now let's go back out west. We see, as if you remember, in 1862, Grant is driving down the Mississippi River. The Navy is driving up the Mississippi River, and the one southern city that is keeping the Mississippi from being controlled by the North is the city of Vicksburg. So, on the top right-hand corner, you see a map. Vicksburg is a southern city that sits high atop a plateau that overlooks the Mississippi River. And Grant sends his Union troops up the hill, but he just can't take the city. It's too steep of a hill, it's too well fortified, and so Grant decides to, instead of attacking the city, he will lay siege to the city, S-E-I-G-E. That means he will surround the city and cut it off from the rest of the world and not let any food or supplies go in or out. He is simply going to starve the city to death until they surrender. So this siege goes on for months. So the people in Vicksburg, the civilians, the Southerners, they run out of food, so they start eating horses. And they run out of horses, so they start eating cats and dogs. And then they run out of their family pets, and so they start eating rats and mice. And they run out of those, and there are even stories of people in Vicksburg resorting to cannibalism. So things are very desperate in Vicksburg. Grant continues to shell the city while he's laying siege to it. And so the people of Vicksburg move out of their homes. As you can see on the right-hand side, they start digging caves into the side of the plateau that the city sits on because they don't want to get blown up in the middle of the night. And so we see really desperate situation here in Vicksburg. The people are reduced to living in holes in the ground, and some of them are starving to death or resorting to cannibalism. So eventually it gets too much for the people of Vicksburg, and they surrender the city on July 4th, 1863. And so we see two big victories for the North in 1863 in July. We see Gettysburg out east and Vicksburg out west. Of course, this is a huge victory for the North because Grant has taken Vicksburg, the North has cut the South in half, part of the Anaconda Plan. Now the North has cut deep into the Southern Confederacy. They now control the Mississippi River, and the eastern part of the Confederacy and the western part of the Confederacy are now divided. We have basically robbed the Confederacy of the manpower and supplies of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, having their strength. And so this is such a big victory that Lincoln finally decides, I want him out east. And so Grant gets promoted, and we will see him in 1864 fighting battles out east against Lee. Finally, Lincoln has found his general who can defeat Lee on the battlefield. During our next lecture, we will continue the second half of the Civil War lecture, and we will take it from 1864 to the end of the war.